The officer thought he had found an easy arrest, a loud one, a public one, the kind that made people step back, pull out their phones, and watch authority reassert itself. But there was one problem. The quiet man he had just grabbed by the collar was the last person in the country he should have touched, and in less than 10 minutes, the entire street would understand why. The police lights were still flashing across the brick storefronts when Officer Daniel Mercer lost his patience. The call had come in as a suspicious individual report. A man standing beside a parked sedan for too long. No clear reason, no clear destination. Just standing. In Mercer's experience, that was enough, because when people called the police in Westbridge City, they expected action, not patience, not conversation, action. So when he stepped out of the cruiser and saw the man leaning calmly against the car, hands in pockets, expression steady, Mercer already felt the familiar irritation building. The man didn't look nervous. He didn't look afraid. And he definitely didn't look impressed. That, more than anything, annoyed Mercer. "Step away from the vehicle," Mercer barked. The man looked at him, not slowly, not defiantly, just calmly, like someone acknowledging a noise. Then he pushed himself upright from the car door. "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was controlled, even. That tone made Mercer's jaw tighten, because people who asked questions instead of apologizing usually thought they were smarter than the situation, and Mercer hated that. "You've been standing here for 20 minutes, Mercer said sharply. "I'm waiting." "For what?" "A meeting." "With who?" The man gave a small shrug. "That depends." Mercer took 2 steps closer. "Depends on what?" "On whether this conversation continues." That was when Mercer grabbed him. A fist tightening into the collar of the tan jacket. Hard. Phones came out instantly from nearby pedestrians. A couple walking their dog stopped. A delivery driver leaned against his van. Police lights reflected across their faces, and Mercer leaned forward until his voice was nearly inside the man's ear. "You don't get to play games with me." But the man didn't flinch, didn't pull away, didn't raise his voice. He simply turned his head slightly and looked at Mercer. Calm, steady, almost curious, like he was studying something. And that made Mercer squeeze tighter. "You think you're above this?" Mercer snapped. "Above what?" "The law." The man's eyes moved briefly toward the police cruiser, then to the gathering crowd, then back to Mercer. "No," he said quietly. "I just prefer it applied correctly." Mercer laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Oh, you're one of those. Those guys who think quoting procedure makes them untouchable." The man didn't respond, but there was something in the silence that made Mercer angrier, so he shoved him against the car, hard enough for the metal to thud. "Hands on the hood." The man slowly placed his hands on the car, still calm, still silent. And that silence was beginning to bother people watching. Because most suspects protested, most suspects argued. This man didn't. He just waited. And somewhere down the street, a second cruiser turned the corner. It's funny to think about where people are listening from right now. Maybe it's late at night where you are. Maybe the sun is just coming up. Every now and then I look through the comments and see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy stories like this one, make sure this channel doesn't disappear from your feed, because the next story might be the one you don't want to miss. We are not creating a single story. We are building a recurring narrative universe. Officer Mercer began patting the man down, fast, rough, performative. The crowd was growing, and Mercer liked when people saw him working. "Name," Mercer demanded. The man didn't answer immediately. Mercer slammed his palm on the hood. "I said name." The man spoke quietly. "Elijah Grant." Mercer repeated it into his shoulder radio. "Dispatch, run Elijah Grant." A pause, then static. The dispatcher responded. "Copy. Stand by." Mercer smirked. This usually takes longer when people have records. Grant didn't respond, but that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was the black sedan behind them. Because it wasn't just any sedan. It was a government vehicle, unmarked, and Mercer hadn't noticed the small federal access tag on the inside of the windshield, but someone else had. Across the street, a woman in a navy suit standing beside a parking meter, watching, not filming, watching. She raised a phone to her ear and spoke quietly. Yes. A pause, then another. Confirm visual. Another pause. Then she looked back toward Mercer. Yes, he just put hands on him. Back at the cruiser, Mercer's radio crackled again, but this time the dispatcher sounded different, less casual. Unit 42. Confirm name again. Mercer rolled his eyes. Elijah Grant. Silence, longer this time. Then, Unit 42. Hold position. Mercer scoffed. Why? But the dispatcher didn't answer. And that was unusual, because dispatch always answered. Mercer tightened the cuffs. Looks like you've got people looking into you, he muttered. Grant finally turned his head slightly. You might want to take those off. Mercer laughed. That right? Yes. Why? Grant looked straight ahead. Because this situation is about to become unnecessarily complicated. Mercer stepped closer. You threatening me? No. Grant paused, then said calmly, I'm warning you. That was when Mercer's partner stepped out of the second cruiser. Officer Lyle Grant, no relation, walked over slowly. Danny. Mercer didn't look at him. Not now. Danny. What? Lyle was staring at the sedan, specifically the small federal access plate. Whose car is that? Mercer glanced back. His. Run the plate, huh? Mercer shook his head. Doesn't matter. But Lyle didn't move, because he had, quietly, already run it from the cruiser, and what came back didn't make sense. Federal clearance, department listing. Restricted, which meant two things. Either the system was wrong, or the man in cuffs wasn't who Mercer thought he was. Dispatch spoke again. This time, the voice wasn't the usual operator. It was someone else. Higher. Unit 42. Mercer sighed. Yeah? Remove the cuffs. Mercer frowned. What? Remove the cuffs immediately. Mercer's jaw tightened. With respect, we're still verifying identity. A pause. Then the voice came back colder. You already verified more than you realize. Mercer looked at Grant. Grant looked straight ahead, calm, like a man who had already seen the end of the conversation. Mercer grabbed his shoulder. You know somebody? Grant didn't answer, but across the street, the woman in the navy suit had stopped pretending to observe casually, because now 3 black SUVs were turning onto the block, and people in the crowd began whispering, federal plates, dark windows. Mercer noticed them, but his ego was already too invested. Looks like you called friends, Mercer said. Grant finally turned his head slightly. No. He nodded toward the vehicles approaching. They called me. Mercer frowned. What? The SUVs stopped, doors opened, and 6 agents stepped out, not rushing, not shouting, just moving with quiet, practiced authority. The woman in the navy suit crossed the street toward them. One of the agents spoke into an earpiece, then walked directly toward Mercer, and stopped, close enough to see the confusion on Mercer's face. Officer? Mercer nodded. Yeah? The agent glanced at the cuffs, then at Elijah Grant, then back to Mercer, and said quietly, You're going to want to release Director Grant. Mercer blinked. Director of what? The agent held Mercer's gaze. The Federal Bureau of Investigation. The entire street went silent. Even the flashing lights suddenly felt too loud. Mercer stared at Grant, then laughed nervously. Yeah, right. But nobody else was laughing, and the agent didn't blink. Behind him, the other agents were already watching the crowd, watching the cruisers, watching Mercer. Like the situation had just shifted. Because it had. And Mercer still hadn't realized the worst part. Because the director of the FBI hadn't been standing there by accident. He had been waiting, watching, testing, and Officer Daniel Mercer had just walked directly into something much bigger than a simple arrest, something that had already exposed departments in 3 other cities, something connected to a quiet oversight division very few people knew existed, and Westbridge City had just become the next investigation. Grant slowly turned his head toward Mercer, still calm, still composed. Then he spoke quietly. "You might want to call your captain." Mercer's grip loosened. "But that won't be the call that matters." And down the street, another convoy of federal vehicles was already arriving, because this stop was only the beginning. The silence on the street was different now, not the casual silence of curiosity. This was the silence people fall into when something shifts, and they don't yet understand what. Officer Mercer still had Elijah Grant pressed against the hood of the sedan, but his grip had loosened, just slightly, enough that Grant could breathe normally again. The 6 federal agents stood in a calm half-circle, not aggressive, not threatening, just present. And the woman in the Navy suit had stopped 2 steps behind them, watching Mercer the way a doctor watches a patient who hasn't yet realized the diagnosis. Mercer cleared his throat. "All right," he said, trying to keep authority in his voice, trying not to show the sudden heat rising in his face. "So what is this? Some kind of misunderstanding?" The lead agent didn't answer immediately. He simply looked down at the cuffs, then back at Mercer. "Officer," he said calmly, "remove them." Mercer's jaw tightened. "You understand we received a suspicious individual report." No one moved. Grant didn't even turn his head. The crowd was bigger now, phones everywhere. Someone whispered, "Did he say FBI director?" Mercer heard it, and that made everything worse, because now the pressure was public. He turned toward Grant. "You want to explain this?" Grant spoke softly. "I already tried." Mercer swallowed, then reluctantly reached forward and unlocked the cuffs. The metal clicked open. Grant slowly pulled his wrists free. He rubbed one wrist gently, not dramatically, just thoughtfully, like someone making a quiet mental note. And that small gesture made Mercer feel something he hadn't expected. Not relief, not embarrassment, something worse, doubt. Grant turned to face him fully now. Up close, Mercer could see something different in the man's eyes. Not anger, not triumph, just calculation. Grant adjusted his jacket collar where Mercer had grabbed it. "You're passionate about enforcement," Grant said. Mercer stiffened. "That's my job." Grant nodded once. "Yes." Then he glanced briefly toward the black sedan and the agents behind him. "But the job is supposed to have guardrails." Mercer opened his mouth, closed it, then gestured at the car. "Look, if you're federal, why are you standing around in a parking lane like a civilian?" Grant didn't answer. The agent behind him did. "Because he was observing." Mercer frowned. "Observing what?" The woman in the Navy suit stepped forward, and now Mercer noticed the small identification badge clipped inside her coat. No department logo, just a seal and a title. She spoke calmly. "Local response behavior." Mercer blinked. "What?" Grant finally looked at the crowd, then back at Mercer. "This intersection has produced 11 citizen complaints in 4 months. Mercer felt his stomach tighten. Grant continued. 4 of those involved officers from your precinct. Mercer's partner Lyle shifted uncomfortably behind him. "But that wasn't the real problem," Grant added quietly. Mercer forced a laugh. "You're telling me the FBI director just stands on sidewalks to run customer satisfaction surveys?" A couple of people in the crowd chuckled nervously, but the agents didn't smile, and Grant didn't either. "Not surveys," he said. "Patterns." Mercer crossed his arms. "Well, congratulations. You found a guy doing his job. Grant tilted his head slightly. Yes, a pause. But that's not what we were testing. Mercer felt something cold slide down his spine. What do you mean, testing? Grant gestured subtly toward the black sedan. The agent beside it opened the rear door. Inside the car, a small camera array blinked quietly. Body angle cameras, audio recorders, timestamps. Grant spoke again. This intersection has been under federal behavioral observation for 2 weeks. The crowd murmured louder. Mercer's throat went dry. Why? Grant answered without raising his voice. Because Westbridge City appeared on a list. Mercer swallowed. What list? Grant's eyes didn't leave his. A list of departments showing early indicators. Indicators of what? Grant paused, and when he spoke again, the words were calm enough to be terrifying. Systemic escalation behavior. Mercer stared. I don't even know what that means. The woman in the navy suit finally spoke again. It means authority drift. She pointed gently toward the cuffs still hanging from Mercer's belt. It means the moment when enforcement stops protecting the public and starts feeding itself. Mercer's face flushed red. That's ridiculous. Grant didn't argue. Instead, he looked toward the growing line of federal SUVs now parking along the street. Doors opening, more agents stepping out. Then he looked back at Mercer. You weren't the only officer we observed today. Mercer blinked. What? Grant nodded toward the woman. Agent Rivera? She tapped her tablet. 23 interactions logged this week. She turned the screen slightly. 7 escalations. Mercer's voice cracked slightly. Escalations? Grant spoke quietly. Situations where authority increased force without corresponding threat. Mercer shook his head. That's subjective. Grant nodded again. Yes. Then he gestured toward the camera array in the sedan. That's why we record it. The street had gone completely silent now. Even the people filming had stopped whispering, because they were starting to understand. This wasn't about one arrest. This was something much bigger. Grant stepped closer to Mercer, not threatening, but close enough that Mercer had to listen. You weren't the primary subject, Mercer frowned. Then who was? Grant looked toward the second cruiser, specifically toward Lyle, but he didn't answer. And that silence made Mercer's stomach twist, because suddenly he realized something worse. This wasn't just an observation, it was a trap, not for him, for the department, and they had walked straight into it. Grant stepped back, then glanced briefly at the crowd, phones, live streams, witnesses. Then he said quietly, This is why we do field observation before formal investigations. Mercer's voice came out lower now. Investigation into what? Grant looked down the street, where another black SUV had just arrived. But this one was different. The seal on the door was unmistakable, Internal Affairs Liaison Division, but not local, federal. Grant's voice remained calm. 3 months ago, we opened a multi-city review. Mercer's mouth went dry. Grant continued. Chicago, Baltimore, Phoenix, and now Westbridge. The words hit the street like thunder. Grant adjusted his cuffs, then looked back at Mercer. You were the first officer to make contact today. Mercer tried to swallow, but you won't be the last person interviewed. Mercer's partner Lyle stepped forward nervously. Sir, we didn't know. Grant raised a hand gently. I know. And that answer somehow felt worse, because it meant something else. Grant turned slightly toward Agent Rivera. How many precincts in the district? She checked the tablet. 4. Grant nodded. And how many officers logged behavioral flags? Rivera hesitated, then answered quietly. 27. The crowd gasped. Mercer stared. That's impossible. Grant didn't argue. Instead, he said something far more unsettling. It would be impossible if this were just one department. Mercer frowned. What does that mean? Grant looked toward the line of SUVs and then beyond them, and toward the skyline of Westbridge City. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Something the department hasn't noticed yet." Mercer felt his pulse spike. "What?" Grant met his eyes. "For the last 2 years, complaints have been disappearing." Mercer blinked. "What are you talking about?" Grant didn't answer immediately, because now the final SUV had arrived, the one with the dark red federal seal. And when the door opened, even the agent straightened slightly. Because the person stepping out wasn't local oversight, wasn't internal affairs. It was the division almost nobody knew existed. The quiet unit inside the Department of Justice that only appeared when corruption had already reached deeper than anyone expected. Grant watched the man walk toward them, then spoke softly. "Because this investigation isn't just about police behavior." Mercer's chest tightened. "Then what is it about?" Grant's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Someone inside the city has been erasing evidence." The crowd stirred again. Grant's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the trail doesn't stop at the police department." He looked toward the courthouse skyline, then toward City Hall, then back at Mercer. "And what we're about to uncover was bigger than this street." He paused, then said one final sentence that would later appear in every news report in the state. "This city is only the 4th domino." And somewhere deep inside Westbridge's government system, someone had just realized the FBI director was no longer observing, he was hunting, and the real target still didn't know. The man stepping out of the final SUV moved slowly, not because he needed to, but because people like him never rushed. The door shut behind him with a quiet, deliberate sound that seemed louder than the police sirens still flashing across the street. Even the federal agents shifted their posture slightly, not dramatically, just enough that Mercer noticed. And that was the moment Officer Daniel Mercer understood something was very wrong. The man wore a simple charcoal suit, no badge hanging from the belt, no visible weapon. But there was a small pin on his lapel, a narrow silver emblem Mercer didn't recognize. Grant did, and he gave a single, respectful nod. "Assistant Director Keller." The man returned the nod. "Elijah." No handshake, just recognition. The kind shared between people who had already had difficult conversations before. Keller looked briefly around the street, the cruisers, the crowd, the agents. Then his eyes settled on Mercer. For a moment, Keller said nothing. He simply studied him, and Mercer felt something strange, like being evaluated by someone who already knew the answer. Finally, Keller spoke. "Officer Mercer?" Mercer blinked. "You know my name?" Keller gave a faint smile. "We try to know everyone's name." That answer didn't comfort Mercer, because it sounded rehearsed, like this had been prepared. Grant stepped beside Keller. The interaction was recorded from 4 angles. Keller nodded slightly. "I saw." Mercer's throat tightened. "You were watching?" Grant answered calmly. "For the last 30 minutes. The words hit Mercer like a punch. 30 minutes, which meant something else. Grant had been there long before the complaint call came in. Mercer looked at him sharply. "You planned this." Grant didn't answer. Keller did. "We set a scenario." Mercer laughed bitterly. "So, I was bait?" Keller shook his head. "No." A pause. "You were data." That word landed harder than anything else. Data. Like this wasn't about a man or an officer. Just a measurement. Mercer looked toward the crowd, cameras, streaming phones, whispers spreading through the street. Then he looked back at Grant. "You made this public." Grant's voice stayed level. "No." He gestured toward the people filming. "You did." Mercer clenched his jaw. But the worst part was beginning to settle in, because now the rest of the federal convoy was unloading equipment. Tablets, case files, secure cases. This wasn't a visit. It was a deployment. Keller turned slightly toward Agent Rivera. Status. Rivera spoke clearly. Field observation phase complete. Trigger event? Rivera glanced toward Mercer. Confirmed. Keller nodded once, then he reached into his coat and removed a thin black folder. He handed it to Grant. Grant opened it slowly. Inside were printed photographs, documents, timestamps. Grant flipped through them quietly. The street was silent enough that Mercer could hear the pages turning. Then, Grant stopped on one photo. He looked at Mercer. Do you know what the most dangerous form of corruption is? Mercer didn't answer. Grant continued. It's not bribery. He flipped another page. It's not organized crime. Another page. It's institutional permission. Mercer frowned. What does that mean? Grant held up one of the photos. It showed an officer, not Mercer, someone else, standing outside the same intersection 2 weeks earlier. The timestamp glowed in the corner. Grant explained, when a system stops correcting itself. Another photo, another officer, another escalation, another complaint, all in the same district, all unresolved. Grant placed the photo back in the folder. Something in this city began filtering complaints before they reached oversight. Mercer felt his stomach twist. That's not possible, Keller answered calmly. Every system has a choke point. Grant looked toward City Hall in the distance, and someone has been using it. The crowd murmured again, because now people weren't just watching a confrontation. They were witnessing the start of something larger. Mercer rubbed the back of his neck. This has nothing to do with me. Grant nodded slowly. That may be true. Mercer's voice rose slightly. Then why am I standing here like a suspect? Grant closed the folder. Because you revealed the entry point. Mercer blinked. What? Grant turned slightly toward the sedan with the cameras. The escalation pattern always begins the same way. He looked back at Mercer. Small authority overreach. Mercer felt heat rise in his chest. You're twisting this. Grant shook his head. No. Then he added quietly, I'm measuring it. Keller stepped forward slightly. Officer Mercer, this moment will be reviewed. Mercer scoffed. By who? Keller answered. 3 oversight divisions. Mercer crossed his arms. And what happens to me? Grant answered without hesitation. That depends. On what? Grant's eyes hardened slightly. On what the next 48 hours uncover. Mercer frowned. What happens in 48 hours? Grant turned toward the line of SUVs. Agents were already setting up portable workstations. A mobile command center, in the middle of the street. Grant spoke calmly. We begin interviews. Mercer looked at Lyle, then back at Grant. With who? Grant replied. Everyone. Then he paused, because now his tone shifted slightly, not louder, but heavier. And eventually, with the person who's been deleting the complaints. Mercer felt his pulse pounding now. Who is that? Grant looked toward Keller. Keller gave a small nod. Grant spoke carefully. We don't know yet. Mercer exhaled in relief, but Grant wasn't finished. We just know the deletions are happening from inside the city's judicial access network. The words landed like a bomb. Mercer blinked. Judicial? Grant nodded. Someone with courthouse clearance. The crowd erupted into whispers. Judges, clerks, city prosecutors, anyone with court access. Mercer felt the ground shift under him. This city has hundreds of people with that clearance. Grant nodded. Yes. Then he said something even more unsettling. But only one of them accessed the database within 6 minutes of your arrest call. Mercer's heart stopped. What? Grant opened the folder again. He turned it so Mercer could see. A single line highlighted, timestamp, database access, user credential. Mercer stared. That can't be right. Grant closed the folder again. We'll verify soon. Mercer looked around the street again. Federal vehicles, agents, the crowd, the cameras. And suddenly, this moment felt much smaller than the storm forming behind it. Grant turned to Keller. Media will arrive within the hour. Keller nodded. And the mayor? Grant's voice stayed calm. He's already been notified, Mercer whispered. Mayor? Grant looked back at him. Yes, Mercer swallowed. Why the mayor? Grant paused, then delivered the sentence that would later become the headline across the entire country. Because if complaints were erased from the judicial system, then the city's entire accountability structure may already be compromised. The street went silent again. Grant looked up at the skyline, then back toward the courthouse. And when he spoke next, it was quieter than before, but far more dangerous. Which means the person responsible is probably very powerful. He paused, then added one final line. And very nervous right now. Across the city, inside a quiet courthouse office, a man stared at a blinking computer screen. A notification had just appeared. Federal oversight access granted. His hands began to shake because the system he had quietly manipulated for 2 years, it had just opened itself to the one agency he had spent those 2 years avoiding, and the first domino had already fallen.